Hi folks, James here with a painting video on covering how to paint flame effects. So what I've got here is I've got a 3D printed Balrog that's gone wrong and is going spare, that I'm going to go through what I think is really quite an accessible technique for painting fire. So what I've done with the Balrog is I've primed it red as a decent base coat. It's going to be nice and hot to start with, and looks a bit funky at the minute because everywhere that's going to be fire has been painted pink just to brighten it up a little bit. So what we're going to do from here is we're going to take, I've got Vallejo model colour ivory, but any kind of off-white bleached bone beige colour will do. I'm going to take this ivory and I'm going to paint this into where I think the brightest bits of the fire or the hottest bits of the fire will be. And it's important, one of the most important concepts with painting fire is to remember that fire is not hot out at the edges, or not its hottest out at the edges here, but hottest at its core, where it's burning from. So one of the decisions that you need to make as a painter is, where do I think the hottest bit of this fire will be? And on this Balrog miniature, we've got, well, what I've picked out to be 2 or 3 main centres of heat. We've got the flames burning on his back, we've got his flaming sword, and if you envision that this is some sort of lava monster, you know, like the Balrog is depicted from Lord of the Rings, I would probably envision that his centre of mass is also his hottest area as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to take just a size 1 or 2 brush with this ivory, and we're going to paint it into where I think the hottest bits will be. We don't need to be too careful here, we can be quite rough, but just going into the recesses of those flames near the centre of the sword, just to pick them out. And like I said, it really doesn't matter about being too careful at this point. You can spend ages being really careful, but actually, as you'll see later on, what we're going to do later, it's going to cover up most of the mistakes that we make, if any. So really just get that in there, not too thick. Make sure your paint's watered down, probably 2 or 3 to 1. So I would say probably like a wash level of thickness, maybe a slightly thick wash consistency. Paint that into the recesses. And what this is going to do is this is going to give us a nice bright base in the recesses to start picking out the yellow and orange from, and hopefully by the end of it, you'll see that there is a little bit of a method to the madness to choosing pink as a secondary base colour. So hopefully you can see that I'm being not too careful here, painting in the white on the sword. Yeah, that's coming across on the video. And then same concept for the main, we're going to just tuck the paintbrush, almost like dabbing it in. That's why you don't need a super special brush, mine's on its last legs. Just dabbing it into those recesses down at the bottom of the main where we think it'd be really hot near his body. If there's any really deep bits of flame coming out, you can go into those as well. But yeah, it's a fairly common, it's a fairly understandable misconception when people first trying to paint fire, that they follow the normal highlighting process, you know, of working from dark in the recesses to light at the edges. So in terms of like a traditional fire, that would be red in the recesses and white at the edges. But like I said at the beginning, fire and flames burn hottest in the centre, which tends to be the deepest point. So you can see that we've dabbed that into the main. And the last bit I'm going to do that I perceive, and this is all your perception, you know, as the painter, it's your artistic license, decide where you think would be hottest. But the last bit where I think is going to be hottest is here, between his chest muscles, between his abs. The guy's been lifting down in them caves. And if you think that there's anywhere else on your models where, you know, would be where the centre of heat would collect, say if you're, I don't know, you could apply this technique to a warp lightning cannon or a warp fire thrower, maybe where around the warp fire would be hottest, you could do that there. Or if you've got somebody that's casting a spell and you want to do some fire effects for the spell, you know, wherever you think the magic it would be concentrated the most would be where you would paint as, like, not traditionally the hottest in that example, but you know, as the focal point. And the last bit that I'm going to do is I'm just going to do really roughly inside his mouth, because again, if we think back to the Lord of the Rings films and depictions of the Balrog and what have you. It's a monster made mostly of fire, shadow and flame. So he's definitely going to have fire in his mouth. We want nice, bright, burning eyes, so you can hopefully see. I've been quite rough there, but put in the beige. And now, as that's been going along, the bits that I started on the sword will have been drying. So what we're going to do next, I'm going to take some contrast yellow, 2 decent dollops of that. I'm going to wash off the excess and do 1-to-1 contrast paint and water. I'm going to take this contrast yellow and we're going to, well, quite literally, just apply this yellow over everything that we had previously painted with the ivory colour. So same brush as before, and again, same kind of care, no need to be super careful. We're going to work from the edges in so that most of our yellow is where we're taking the brush off the model is where it's going to leave the most paint. So we want to leave the most paint in the deepest areas that we possibly can, because it's those bits that we think are going to be yellow. So I don't know whether you'll be able to see it at the minute, but when I pause and take a picture, hopefully you'll be able to see it, is that already you're starting to see a little bit of the pink theory coming into play. A weird little bit of colour theory is that it's easier to paint yellow colours over a pink base. Don't ask me why, but when we do this, where we've left the pink and not put the ivory colour in, starting to shade it orange and create, without too much effort, a little bit of natural blending. Emphasis on the little bit because it isn't perfect yet. So just really, really rough. Cover all of that beige and a bit of the pink with the yellow. There we go. Quite a nice bright yellow sword there in the recesses where we think would be hottest. Exactly the same approach for the mane again. We're going to tuck that yellow contrast paint into those recesses. Working quite quickly here, just trying to avoid any bits that might look like they're still drying for the time being. At this point, again, it wouldn't be the end of the world if we accidentally hit a bit that was still drying. It would just mean that that beige would mix with the yellow. But you'll see when we get right near the end that kind of any rough bits are going to get covered up anyway. And I suppose that segues into why red base. It didn't have to be a red base. I could have started this from any primer. I could have started it from black and just put the beige into the recesses. I could have started from a sort of tan or flesh colour, if you will, that would have taken the beige over it a bit easier. But I decided to go with red because obviously I'm doing red flame here, and when we get to the final stages and we're covering up most of the model with the black and grey colours, that red is going to, first off, hide any mistakes, anything that we might have missed, as it's still a lavery look, but also that red is going to start it's going to hang around in the very small scales and still give us that molten lavery look. So I'm just dabbing in. I've got this yellow into his chest muscles, between his abs, into some of these spikes. You'll note that his hands are pink, and I haven't done anything with his hands yet. That's because I don't envision those being particularly hot, and we're going to get to those in a minute when we get to the orange step. So good amount of yellow in his mouth, that's where we think that's hottest. Make sure we get all of those bits on the mane. And if you want to do a second pass over bits as it's dried, that's fine. Just really make sure that yellow's in the recesses, really make it pop. The reason for diluting the contrast paint down is just so that it doesn't sit too thick in the recesses. I'm not applying this like a wash, I'm applying this more like a thick glaze, if you will, or just like a normal layering. So we're not totally losing control of the paint here. We want it a little bit thinner so that we can apply more layers. So before I pause there, we can see that really quickly we've got the yellow deep down in the recesses where we think it's hottest. We've got a little bit of orange where the yellow is covering the pink and red base, and then we've got the red right outside at the outer edges. We're nowhere near done here. We've got a few steps left to go before it's finished, but already you can kind of see how it's coming together. So we'll pause there and come back when the yellow's dry. Right, so now our reds, oranges and yellows are all nice and dry. We're going to move on to kind of, the rest of the model now really, or I suppose the finishing touches to the fire effect, and then the rest of the model, which is really going to make the fire effect that we've just done pop. So I've got Vallejo colour burnt red here. You can really use the red of your choice, it doesn't overly matter too much. If you want to use a really nice bright one like the GW contrast bar red I did before, you can do. I quite like this dark one because, again, what we're doing at this step now, what we're doing is we are going from where the fire turns to ash, starts to turn to ash, and then as the ash steadily turns to what will be shadow to the rest of the Balrog. So I've got 3 size dry brushes here. I've taken the medium size one and just loaded it up with burnt red, and then used this tissue here to wipe off or brush off the excess. I'll try and show you on my hand if I can. Dry brushing it onto our hand, you can see that it's ever so slightly, very slowly building up. That's kind of what we want. We don't want a big smear on our hand, on my hand while I'm doing it. And just very lightly against the grain of the fire, we're going to start brushing this burnt red on, mainly to the tips. So if we run it along the whole length of the sword, it'll pick up on the highest bits. And this is where you're going to start seeing that the reason why you didn't need to be too careful on the earlier steps, because this dry brushing is going to start covering up a whole world of sins. Hopefully you can see that darker shade coming through. I'm probably going to need some more of this burnt red in a minute because there's a lot of fire. I've severely underestimated how much I was going to need. Same thing on the other side, just against the grain of the fire, specifically on the tips, but really anywhere along it. This is where the highest bits of the fire, as it like detaches, I suppose, from the body of the flame, will start to turn to ash and smoke. With dry brushing, you can be quite rough-handed, as long as you've rubbed off the excess paint. Same approach for the main, just really quite broad along the tops. Going a little bit with the grain there, just to get this into this section that I can see real deep down, that I'm not going to get to with the dry brush otherwise. With dry brushing, you don't need to worry too much. Again, you don't need to worry about being careful because it's not like the paint's wet, the paint isn't going to run into the recesses. It's called dry brushing for a reason. You're only brushing real small amounts of paint onto the edges where it'll pick it up. I was starting to run out, so as expected, I need a bit more burnt red. Load up the brush again, get rid of the excess. Quick test on the hand again. See, that's coming out a bit thick still. That was smearing on my hand a little bit. What we want is just a dusting. So back to the main. When you've reloaded your brush, it's normally a good idea to start on a higher bit, or an area that you want most of the paint focused on, just in case you've not wicked enough off your brush onto your hand before. If you, like I did on my hand, if you end up smearing it on, then you can lose the work that you've been doing. And I'm going to just really quite a heavy dry brush now onto the chest and turn the plinth around a bit so I can get to it. I might need to take it off the plinth in a minute actually. So you can see now, hopefully what's becoming clear now is that the bits where we were a bit messy with the orange and yellow are steadily being covered by the dry brushing. Take it off the plinth so I can hit these rock hard abs. They're pretty mad too if the dwarves were interrupting my centuries-long gym session. Just constant ab crunches. That brush up again because it's starting to run out. This colour that I'm using is actually a darker red than what I used at the base, but that's not a problem because this isn't going to be our end colour anyway. This is mainly just to pick up, start covering over the bits that were a bit rough. And hopefully you can see that I'm being really quite heavy-handed with the dry brushing because it needs to cover these areas. So I'm going to do the same thing over the forearm flaps, I don't know, forearm gills or scales, whatever they are. Just cover up those raised bits. When I've done this step, I'll pause and take an update photo of how it looks before we do the last one. Hopefully I don't end up needing another bit of burnt red just for this last little arm, but we'll see. It's going to need a little bit more. It's probably my only criticism of dry brushing is that it feels quite wasteful. You're essentially just getting a load of paint, getting rid of a load of paint, letting a load of paint dry. Other than that, I think it's a really solid technique for getting fast results. Okay, now that our yellow is nice and dry, we're going to take our contrast red. And if you remember just a minute ago, I said that this was just 2 parts yellow, 2 parts water that we had before. So that's the wrong size brush. So what we're going to do is we're just going to start off with just 1 part red in this, and that has absolutely nuked it to red, which isn't what we wanted. So in the words of Bob Ross, that was a happy little accident. We'll start again. We'll take 1 part yellow and we'll take a very small dab of red. It's still quite red, but I need quite a lot of this colour, so we're just going to continue go back and forth with it until we get it right. We'll try another dab of, yeah, there we go, starting to get more of an orange colour. I think if we just go for 1 more dab of yellow, and I'm washing my brush between putting it back in the pot so I don't end up putting a load of red into my contrast yellow. So what we've got there is quite a nice kind of dark tangerine kind of colour. I'm going to add a couple parts water to this because we want it that kind of almost glaze consistency, but we're using contrast paints here, so it's still heavily pigmented. And the reason we want it at that glaze consistency, especially for this step, is because what we're going to do now is we're going to paint from where the yellow that we applied earlier ends to the end of the flame, but we are going to overlap the yellow section ever so slightly with this semi-transparent orange colour. And what that's going to do is, hopefully, in theory, create again a little bit of a natural blend between the yellow step and this orange step. So what we're doing with this orange is we're going just a tiny bit over our yellow, right to the end of the flame to capture the rest of it. And again, this is going quite nicely over the pink, creating a little bit of a natural blend. Not much, it's not perfect, but by the time it's all finished, you have to really be looking at it to pick it out. What is important here is that you make sure you pick up on any bits that you missed from the previous step. So what you don't overly want is big chunks of pink showing through at the end. So if you've missed any areas of pink, you could either go back and hit them with the yellow if you think it's one of those hot areas that we talked about a minute ago, or you can just hit it with this orange. Make sure you're getting all the recesses, because that'd really throw it off. I don't think Tolkien particularly envisioned pink Balrogs knocking around. Not that you couldn't do that if that's how you wanted to paint it, but there we go. So again, you don't need to be too careful at this point. Priority is creating a little bit of transition between the yellow and orange, but also just making sure that you've covered up all your pinks. Same thing with the chest. I'm going to paint away from the center points that we believe are hottest. So like there, I accidentally got a little bit of orange in the crease that I decided was really hot. So just dab off the paint, remove it from where you accidentally got it, and carry on. There's no need to worry too much. And at this step as well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get into these, like, I don't know, armpit scales. I suppose you could call them, under his armpit. Make sure that they're not pink. They're also on his shoulder here as well. Getting there. I'm going to move to a slightly bigger brush because I'm covering bigger areas here. Use a bit more paint for these really scaly bits so that it goes into the recesses a bit easier without damaging my brush. Up at these like clavicle bits where his collarbone meets his shoulder, make sure that that's orange. We put a bit of orange over that so it like transitions out to where we think would be, no, it's going to be cold, but you know, coolest on this guy. Previous steps, I haven't done anything with his hands or the little frilly bits that around his hand, forearms, because I didn't particularly envision them to be overly hot. So I'm just going to hit these entirely with the orange now, and then at the end, when we've finished the whole guy, this might be an area that we revisit just to put in some heat points around them. Although they're not like a center point of heat, there would still be bits of it that would be hotter than others. It's not all going to be like one temperature. In the same way that if you had a pile of burning embers, some of them are black, some of them are bright red, some of them are orange, you know, it's not all one temperature. So just make sure that all those pink bits are covered up on his forearms, and then onto the mane, and same thing on the mane. Dab off a little bit of paint, had too much on my brush then. We're going from part way over the yellow all the way up to the tips of his mane, trying not to let too much of that orange sit in the recesses and create really harsh jumps, you know, because that'd be like if a big bit of orange sat in a recess over the yellow, that could create quite a harsh jump from the yellow to the orange. What we want is a decently thin layer of paint, well, of contrast paint over the yellow. Okay, so last step for kind of just creating the bulk of the flame effect. We're going to take, I need a lot more black than that, I'm going to take a large dry brush this time, and I'm probably going to need to move between a large dry brush and a small dry brush to make sure I get into all the different sections of this. Large dry brush loaded up in the same way that we did before. However, I don't want to get too much of the paint off this time, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the whole of his torso, all of his arms, all of his hands, the whole of his face, and just really avoid the flames on his back and the sword, because we don't want to cover up all of that flame work that we've done. So I'm going to start out where the detail is deepest, just to wick off some of that paint from the dry brush. Not going to stray too close to the flames on his back here. And what I'm doing at this stage is just having a bit of a sense check of the direction that the scales are going in, and trying to stick to that direction as much as possible. Now this is quite a big dry brush. The horns are going to ultimately be black anyway, so I'm not going to pay too much care and attention to them. For now, I'm just going to go over them in the process of painting the face. Tread quite carefully over the chest area so that we don't get into those recesses and mess up that nice hot Balrog look that we've spent all this time working on. Get into these gaps. I'm definitely going to need a smaller dry brush to get under his chin, under his arm, underside of these scales / flame area. Carefully around the bottom of the sword. It doesn't matter too much if you just clip like the edges of the flame a little bit, because obviously, like I've said, what we're trying to capture is the movement of fire from being incredibly hot to ash, and some of that will be would I suppose be on his mane and on his sword, but we want to be careful because we don't want to completely brush over everything that we've just spent some time doing. If you're a more patient person than me, you can do this all with a much smaller dry brush, but essentially all of this is just laying the groundwork, getting what can be quite a difficult process of painting flame out the way relatively easily, so that we can spend more time on the rest of the model. So again, the lines on the hand are running down that way, so I'm going to brush across them this way to only pick up on the edges. That's probably the most I'm going to get with that brush, so we'll leave him there for now. In with the small brush. I'm not going to bother with the medium one because it's, in fact, you can't quite see it, it's still soaking in the water pot. So same approach, whatever the size of the brush. Yeah, there we go. We can get under the neck, under the chin, inside those horns to his jaw. Yeah, this one's loads easier for getting into the smaller areas. I use round dry brushes now. I used to, for years and years, I've been in the hobby for 20 years, over 20 years now, and for years and years used flat-headed dry brushes, and I only very recently bought a pack of round-headed dry brushes, and I would probably never go back now. So I just think the fact that you can apply paint evenly in any direction is just a much better shape for dry brushing, to really get into those sections that I couldn't with the big dry brush. Make sure that the areas that I could just about get into with the bigger dry brush, but maybe didn't cover quite as well, are still covered. That side of the face is going to be a bit tricky. We might need to come back to that side of the face later. And now that we've got a smaller dry brush that we've got more control over, get nice and close to the flames. Realise I'm on the other side of the flames here to what you can probably see. Get really nice and close to the flames. Flick my finger a little bit, as I just painted the edge of the fire, which isn't what we want. Here's just a little bit of a better, more focused view of the finished look. Kind of in the round, you can see that we've really got that heat on the sword, and in the mane, in the eyes and mouth, and in his centre mass. So like I said, with all the details and everything, leave that for people to fill out themselves, or if people want me to do another video on painting the details, I'm happy to do that. But that was just really a quick and easy way of getting the effective looking flames. Cheers all.